Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. Donald Trump has pivoted to the domestic after a big blow up over the Venezuela strike. Trump seems to have returned his focus to the United States, recognizing that domestic policy is king, something that his constituents are absolutely looking for as gains, especially in the area of standard of living and affordability. So Trump has made two big announcements recently. One is his intention to restrict the purchase of residential property by finance, large conglomerates, corporations to ensure that single families, the average person, have more affordable housing, that it's not all being gobbled up and they're being pushed into the rental economy the way that it seems like many large corporations have been trying to move our real estate market. The other big announcement he made is that he intends to cap credit card interest at 10%, effectively eliminating usury, a huge change, I think, and ultimately one that he can't unilaterally make. So we're going to be discussing why he's announced these changes, what it would take to actually get this stuff done, and what the underlying principles are for the American people. Joining me today to discuss that is, of course, one of our favorite co-hosts, the Prudentialist. Matthew, thank you so much for coming on, man.
Yeah, thank you, Auron, for having me on again. It's always a pleasure.
Of course. So, like I said, there's been these two announcements, and we can't really look at them without separating, obviously, the current events that are going on. Now, in one way, the Trump administration got a rude awakening and got snapped back to domestic policy by the events going on in Minnesota. Everything that's happening with ICE and the pushback against agents after we had, I think, what is a entirely justified shooting of a terrorist who attempted to kill an ICE agent, but has continued to return focus away from the foreign policy sector and back to what's happening domestically here in the United States. Also, guys, I should say we are pre-taping this, so if we're talking about this like, we don't know what's already happened, if some major event has happened, this is going to come out on Wednesday, and that's why we don't know. Also, obviously, we can't take any questions due to that. But Matt, looking at both of these actions, these are things that you and I have ultimately said would be great ideas. Many people, I think, in the new right have asked that we see a return to focusing on building that ability for families to form, to own houses, young people to acquire houses. They're more likely to have children, more likely to have larger families. When they do that, obviously, we both know that debt is a massive problem with everyone, but especially young people in the United States. So I see both of these proposals as rather positive suggestions. However, these are obviously things that the president can't just do on his own. Even with executive orders, it seems like there's very little latitude for him to make significant policy changes. So what do you think is ultimately going on with the presentation of both of these concerns back to back?
For me, it seems like he's setting the agenda in order to make the case for why he and the Republican Party should stay in power, at least in Congress, throughout the midterm election. I think that this pivot has coincided on top of numerous elections in which Democrats have done very well in. We saw numerous gubernatorial sweeps from Democrats across the country, as well as mayoral elections, not just in New York, but also in the Miami-Dade area as well, where I think it's the first time in like 30-something years that Democrats taken office. And a lot of these campaigns that Democrats have been focusing on has been primarily on the issues of affordability and the ability to have their quality of life just see an overall improvement, whether it's due to claims of inflation or the amount of economic opportunities that are available. Democrats everywhere, from Zora Mandani to Amy Acton in Ohio, who was running against Vivek Ramaswamy, has been championing on the issues that people who work hard should be rewarded for the labor that they've put forward into the economy and into the system, and that system should work for them. And to me, it echoes a conversation I had not too long ago with some friends I have in my historical society here where I live, and the topic of Charlie Kirk had come up, and the last appearance he had on Tucker Carlson I thought was very eerily prophetic, because it's the affordability issues, it's the questions of, does the system ever really serve me at all? And if it doesn't, then I'm going to go vote for people that I would never vote for before, or I would support those that have no real support for my interests or my identity at heart, but say that they're actually going to do something about it. And people who say that they're going to do things are going to be much better than those that are talking about it or tweeting about it from the perches of power. So I think it's very positive to see Trump return to domestic issues. Obviously, that is where all things really do matter for the American voter, especially as we come up on the 26 midterms and the primaries. And so I think that we're going to see a State of the Union address probably in the next, couple of months, and that these actions are going to be his charge to press on Congress to do so. I know that he announced that he's going to do the credit card, interest rate cap at 10%. He wants to announce that on January 20th. On the anniversary of him being sworn in. And I don't know if he's planning to go further with that with the State of the Union. I don't know yet. But I think it just comes to show that some of the issues that he's been promising on during the campaign, I think he's trying to come up with a legislative agenda to secure the victory for him and his party come the election.
Yeah, these are largely conversation starters. I agree with you. And that's wise because, one, it sets the stage, lets Congress know where they should expect things to be directed. It builds the expectations of the average person. It changes the discussion inside the news media. And even if you're not going to immediately be able to achieve these things, your constituents are going to feel better knowing that you're talking about them, working towards them. But of course, these are all going to be large mountains to climb. Now, a lot of people have started to ask me for predictions. Hey, it's the new year. What do you think is going to happen here? What do you think is going to be the big deal coming up? And I've given the same answer every time I'm asked is, look, the thing that's going to be every president's problem, left, right, Republican, Democrat, is going to be affordability. I mean, I don't have to tell you this. I probably don't have to tell our audience this, but our economy is a runaway train, right? Like there is no escape from kind of the democratic problem. You and I think have even read Nick Land's Zombie, Democracy, the zombie apocalypse, essay where he just talks about, democracy is this like ravenous horde looking to consume everything. And you have a serious problem where in any kind of vote-based political order, the ability to promise people stuff is really the key thing. I know Republicans hate to hear that, but it's just true. Patronage is what makes politics work. And so in a democratic process, whoever offers more stuff is usually going to win in the long term. And of course that works, but it also creates long-term problems because you're printing and spending to try to get at all of this. And there's all the advantages built in for who gets to move first on the money and manipulate the interest rates. And so you're just going to constantly have the scenario where, the boomers want their house values to go up and corporations continue wanting to be able to use the advantages of leverage and all of these things. And so inflation is just going to keep happening. We can blame Republicans. We can blame Democrats. We can blame abstract principles and social policies and monetary theory. But at the end of the day, this is just responding to the political marketplace, right? Like this is what the people think they want. And this is how politicians deliver it to them. And there's just no way to escape from that cycle. And so the trick is really to kind of blame your opponent for why the affordability crisis continues to happen, even though it's going to happen whether it's under Republicans again or Democrats. However, if you can make these minor policy changes, then you can at least better the lives of some people. You can adjust and address some level of the problem. And that's worth doing. Just because the ship is sinking slowly doesn't mean you don't plug as many holes as you can and bail out as much water as you possibly can. And so let's look at these two policies. The easy one first. I think this is the easier one to sell, the easier one to try to get through Congress. It's the harder one for the Democrats to fight back against. And that is the housing affordability issue, right? Like nobody except corporations wants corporations to own homes. Like it just doesn't make sense unless you're one of these diehard libertarians or conservative that just vomits out whatever free market rhetoric you got fed back into you at one point. Everyone can think about why having a BlackRock or whatever these large investment firms holding large amounts of real estate and forcing people in the rental market. Everyone understands why that's bad. And so even the Republicans, I think, can be pushed on board, can be guilted into it. And the Democrats reflexively want to fight back against everything Trump does. But what possible argument can they have against this, right? Like this is just exactly their kind of complaint. Or like maybe they want to abolish private property altogether. But other than that, how do they even argue against the idea that corporations shouldn't be able to own residential real estate?
I mean, that's going to be the really good question is how do you steel man, the ongoing purchasing of homes or vast swaths of real estate or even Where I live, I know that the neighboring counties around me have a lot of farmland that has been bought up because of the outpouring of both like the various suburbs and cities that are now being eaten alive by either the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, or if you're even further south, like the greater Austin area. Like there's no no area left for a lot of suburban sprawl, and instead a lot of it has been turned into apartments, and a lot of it has been an avenue for real estate. Or I know it's been sort of a boogeyman to discuss the question of like private equity or anything like that, but I mean, it is a very easy sell rhetorically that we are going to ban the usual boogeymen left, right, and center that kind of would all agree that, like, yeah, actually, I don't think that these guys have the average American's interest at heart, which is things like BlackRock or the rest, despite the fact that, in the previous administration, they were quite all over the place in terms of policy. So I think this move is going to be an interesting one. And I know that he's not really going to be able to do it without Trump, as he had said in his Truth Social post. He says he'll be calling on Congress to codify it. He says he's going to be immediately taking steps to ban large institutional investors from buying more single-family homes. I think that I think this is a much better direction rhetorically and politically than the question over 50-year mortgages that was proposed just a few months ago. But of course, the ongoing question is going to be, how many of these homes are going to be available? What are we actually doing? There's so many questions that remain to be seen. But in terms of, legislative support, a lot of Trump allies have already moved forward on this. He says, I think it was Senator Bernie Moreno from Ohio. He had said that he wants to introduce legislation in the Senate to do so. So I think that already you're going to be moving forward on that. And also, I think it's sort of a bipartisan win if he wants to go that route. I know the Democrats tried to do something similar in 2023. However, that it was narrow votes, and of course the question of special interests always arise. So I think that it's just going to be what major shifts or turbulence is the housing market going to see by doing this, and if so, is this going to open up quote unquote Main Street again? Are we going to see more local realtors do this rather than large corporate ones? And will we see that move in other sectors of the economy? I don't know, but I think that saying that, hey, this is no longer going to be a rental property, and this is going to be something where, there are home loans and other predatory systems in place that prevent, Americans from actually getting homes, then yeah, I mean, let's go for it. Let's see what this does for the average homeowner.
Yeah, I really think this is a winning issue just across the board, and not just because it's been a hobby horse of mine for a while, but like I said, I just can't imagine a coherent argument from the left other than Orange Man bad about how you can really oppose this, which means your real enemies, funny enough, on this will be from the right. I'm sure that you'll have some Chamber of Commerce Republicans or, wildly ideological free trade guys who will try to push back against this. But I don't think their arguments will be strong. I think the biggest block for this, sadly, will be, as you point out, how closely this administration has worked with many of those financial institutions, BlackRock, Blackstone. I mean, BlackRock, Larry Fink's helping to buy Ukraine at this point, right? Like we're literally working out a deal with him right now to see how much of Ukraine can be sold to BlackRock. So is an administration and probably a Congress that is largely in bed with these organizations going to tell these organizations, no, you can't buy this stuff? Are they going to have to offer these people some kind of carrot to go along with the stick? These are all questions that I think are what would really impact the ability to move this forward. However, I will say, watching every congressman squirm as they're forced to attack their big donors or openly choose their donors over the basic sanity of allowing families to own homes, that's an exercise worth going through, even if I guess you can't ultimately secure that. So, like I said, I think that's the easier one. I think that's the one that's easy to justify, hard to argue against, would have the most support, would be the most difficult for even the average Republican to fight back against. It would really just come down to whether politicians would defy their donors, which is actually the largest of all hurdles, I understand, but at least it's just the one instead of a multiplicity of issues. Now, the other suggestion is the credit card one, and I think this one's interesting for a few reasons. One, Joe Biden was famous for being a huge fan of the credit cards and fighting for credit card companies. So it's good rhetorically for Trump. He gets to rail against that. Two, I have suggested that there is a serious problem with usury several times. Now, that's not because I'm a great moral philosopher or rocket scientist. It's because I can read the Bible. and also other sources of moral wisdom. And they uniformly say that usury is a problem. They all note that this is a dangerous thing to consistently engage in. But every time I suggest that perhaps usury is not the best, like I even cited Aristotle at some point, pointing out that the problems of usury, I get just absolutely attacked on all sides. I get attacked by people who say, "Oh, well, you're just wanting to go back to the Stone Ages or the Middle Ages." Well, maybe the Middle Ages, but you're out there trying to destroy all of human progress as if compound interest is the key to human progress. I get people who are economic libertarians. I get free traders. I also weirdly get people who say any pointing, and I promise I'm not making this up. I was accused of it several times. Anyone suggesting the restriction of usury is somehow anti-Semitic, like somehow that's like an anti-Semitic trope. I don't know why. The Bible says don't do it, so there's that. So it's in the Old Testament, by the way. That's where that dictate comes from. It's not like it's just a New Testament thing. So I think it should be clear to like lots of Christians that usury is bad. But the minute I bring it up, and this is always the funniest thing, I always get, well, how do you know what usury is? Like, how do we know how much is usury? Which is so weird. It's like all of a sudden Christians become these like moral relativists whenever you talk about financial instruments. Like, they're just like, how could you know? Who are you to say? Like, I think we can use common sense. Like, usury is the over offering of interest, right? Like, if I'm paying more, if there's more in interest than I could possibly ever pay off, if we're putting so much compound interest on something that it's going to put people into long-term debt slavery, that's usury. But maybe that's 20%, maybe that's 15%. I think 10% is actually a pretty good number. Actually, I think that's a reasonable number. It gives institutions enough to get a return on their investment for lending to people, but it's not so much that it would make it impossible for the average person to catch up with that debt at some point. I think actually 10% is quite a good middle road number. I would have gone a little lower, others would have gone a little higher, but I think that's a reasonable one. So what do you think about, I guess, the larger discussion on usury, and then we'll get to like the practical application of if they could ever actually get this done?
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty, it's one of those third rail topics, or at least it's a word that becomes a third rail topic in American politics. And I think a lot of it has to do with the American political scene being very much charged with any form of accusations of bigotry, or more recently anti-Semitism when it comes to the right. We've already witnessed that on the left a lot since October 7th. It played a large part, I think, in the 2024 election, at least in places like Michigan. We saw how that went for Kamala Harris in various parts in that state, especially due to various immigrant populations. The same thing also too when it comes to like the broader scope of both these questions, both the interest cap, but also the question of like housing, is that the nitty gritty remains to be the ultimate question on these issues. I mean, firms that own 100 or more single family homes, according to an article I was reading on CNBC in preparation for this discussion, says that that's about 2% of the nation's single family housing stock. It also raises some interesting questions of like, well, if we're banning them, what else are we going to do to alleviate home prices? How much is available? And this is going to, of course, imagine, like you had said, be conversation starters. And the same thing when it comes to the credit card question, or at least for capping interest rates on credit cards at 10%. I know that the Federal Reserve plays a small role for what the rates are for them, which is then calculated alongside the borrowing rate based on a user's credit history. And are they considered a risky, person to borrow or lend money to? And there's a lot that goes into it. So, I mean, it's going to be a question of like, well, what does that really mean? I think that when we also look at our financial system today, everything has been incredibly financialized. I mean, we have witnessed that things have gone from tangibility to the question of like owning. And it was funny. I was talking with Benjamin Boyce not too long ago, and he said, I became a homeowner, and then he had to put homeowner in scare quotes, so to speak, because
I signed a piece of paper that says the bank owns a home.
Yeah, the bank owns a home, or exactly, right? Like you don't really own that home. And even then it's going to be set for years and years and years until you pay that off. But I mean, on the question of credit cards too, the question of enforcement becomes really interesting because there are so many not bank accounts, but are acting like bank accounts nowadays. Things are not so tied to usual brick and mortar financial institutions or even large corporate ones like Wells Fargo and the rest, because everything nowadays has a way for you to get a card. I can get a card through PayPal. I can get a card through other sort of payment apps and Venmo and all the rest. And while those operate, of course, through various similar payment processors, you can technically treat that as a bank account without actually having a formal bank account at your local credit union or at a large banking institution. So, I mean, the question of enforcement becomes an interesting one, but also at the same time, it opens up so many other third rail discussions about credit and about who gets lended to and who is lending. Because when we look at, say, there's a lot of videos out there on social media that show how individuals will buy a used car and get an auto loan, and the financial paperwork that they all fill out. One, most people are not financially literate. That is a huge problem in this country, is that we have a substantial lack of financial literacy. I'm sure that is going to be an interesting thing to break down if you're to break that upon American demographics. But nevertheless, on top of that, you also have the issue of that you do have risky, people who want to, get access to credit. And what do you do with that? Are you going to ban them from that? And that's already a question that's being raised. I imagine that someone could easily raise a 14th Amendment kind of lawsuit about, the equal protection clause and their access to things, or even along civil rights lines. So you're touching the third rail, of course, about, touching our financial institutions, which everything has become over financialized. We don't regulate things like Klarna. We don't regulate things that can be at ridiculous rates. We don't look at, the consequences that they may have. And of course, now this wanton amount of online gambling, it's a whole other discussion for another time. But I think that, trying to put some kind of regulatory pressure on the very question of whether you want to call it usury or if you want to call it the over financialization of everything, it really does show that the Trump administration is looking at something that is quite serious, which is that, even Black Friday, details from this last holiday season really does come to show how bad everyone was using buy now, pay later kind of things for their equipment. This isn't like layaway, back when you and I were younger, or our parents wanted to save up and pay for something like a ring or whatnot. Now it's just anything, and it's instantly in your hands, and that's how it's going to be. And then the consequences of whether or not you pay becomes a whole other discussion. And then who's left holding the bag? So, I mean, these are good things to have conversations on, and I hope to see more policy focus on this question later, but it's good to be discussed.
Yeah, you Zoomer kids don't remember the people showing up to J.C. Penney's to put down $50 on something for 6 months before they finally owned it in the layaway program. Yeah, no, there's a lot of really interesting, I think, and deep problems wrapped up in this. It seems like a very small issue. It seems like a 10%, whatever. Like, actually, there's so many things wrapped up in this, and you kind of highlighted a few of them there. So I want to pull that apart a little bit, because I do think there's some fascinating issues to think about. The first one is the way in which, as you say, over financialization creates this really interesting dynamic that puts a way more emphasis on financial literacy. Because when we say financial literacy, there's a certain amount of like, okay, how to write a check and how to keep a bank account and apply for a loan and get insurance and these kind of things that they used to kind of teach you in school to some degree, but less and less that happens. But one of the things is that one of the reasons you need more financial literacy is you've increased financial complexity, right? So if the average person just needs to like save money in a bank and work, those are pretty basic things, right? Like, maybe you have to learn how to get a bank account and write a check, but relatively you can figure that out. That's not super complicated. But the more you financialize, the more you move things into this realm where you need to be making these investments and hedging things and figuring out the tax shelters and the IRAs, and do you want a Roth or do you want a traditional? Should you be moving into gold? What about Bitcoin? What are the restrictions? The more you are forced to interact with these things because of the complexity of the financial market, the more financial literacy becomes critical, right? And the higher level of financial literacy you have to achieve just to keep the basics up. And this becomes a class issue, because the rich are going to be the ones who are more familiar with these complex financial instruments, and those who are not in those classes are much less likely to have the ability to understand that. And that can be a huge hindrance for the average American. Most people can't spend a large amount of their time learning everything about financial markets and the way they should be manipulating their money to stay ahead of the game. So if you're one of these people who is on top of all of that, or you can pay someone enough to be on top of that for you, then you gain a first mover advantage and a advantage of complexity on the rest of the economy. You have a built-in, baked-in advantage over everyone else you're competing with. There's also the issue of race when it comes to credit. Famously, there are different classes, there are different groups who are less likely to have good credit, and when you shrink that credit cap, you're also shrinking the number of people banks will lend to, right? Because okay, I'm probably not going to lend to you if you're high risk at 10% because there's just not enough return for me to take that risk. At 30%, well, maybe I will, because even if you don't pay off the whole thing, I'm still going to make a decent amount of money off of you over time. Maybe it's worth taking that risk. And so, a lot of minorities and others who might have bad credit will be stuck at the margins. Now, all of a sudden, they won't get those loans. Now, in my mind, you shouldn't have gotten those loans at all. The interest rate was so high that it was always a bad move for you to take that loan. And so the fact that you get access to that loan at 25% instead of 10%, that's not actually an advantage for you. But in the mind of many, just not having access to credit is the problem, right? And this ties us back to the last thing I want to say, which is that when you have really a decent amount of interest rates on loans in general, when you have a high degree of leverage because of the percentages and the availability of credit, that drives up the price of everything. That it creates inflation. Why are homes more expensive? Well, there's a lot of reasons, but one of them is that more people can get mortgages, and they can get mortgages for longer, which means they can pay more for houses. So you have to compete with more people over the price of the house, and they can offer more money on the house. And this is true of cars, and this is true of everything, because the more people can get leverage, the higher prices they can pay for basic goods, the more the price you're going to have to pay as well. And there's this like credit spiral that happens. And you can see this in the housing market. And to a large degree, the booms and busts of the housing market are also booms and busts in credit availability. And so when you have a lot of money chasing houses out there, the prices shoot through the roof. And that's what creates a large amount of your housing inflation. You see, again, same thing with colleges. The fact that kids can take out $200,000 loans for a school is why those schools can charge that much money. If they couldn't get access, if people with no job history and nothing, no actual property couldn't get $200,000 loans, we wouldn't be seeing the ridiculous tuitions that we're seeing. So just across the board, the availability of credit creates, in many ways, the affordability problems it's meant to solve. So I know it threw like a lot of stuff out there, but just wherever you want to tackle it, what about these many different issues that the high interest rates or availability of credit create?
Yeah, and I mean, this is the thing that most of people aren't going to be aware of, and it's something that has been often talked about since I was young, and I'm sure the same thing for you, that we ask ourselves questions like, well, when are the things that we learn in school are going to be applicable? Or I wish that my regular W-2 tax form for the average wage earner was something that was taught in school as well. And I mean, those are obviously an education question, but also a parental one as well. We have a lot of things in our culture, at least, has abdicated parental responsibility, and a lot of that, of course, has a lot to do with the dual income trap that has often been discussed, but it's also now a necessity in order to be able to afford your family or your home and your lifestyle. There's a question of decadence in there, but I'm not someone who promotes the idea of downward mobility as being honorable. And at the same time, you also have the issue and the question of just like, America is not a place where we could rely on swift problems to financial issues. I mean, this isn't like the savings and loan crisis of George H.W. Bush's time either. It's much more massive, it's much more complex, and a lot of it is predicated on perception and belief more than anything that might be written on paper. This is why we put so much stock, at least for when it comes to policymakers and economic writers, we put so much emphasis on consumer confidence than anything else. And access to credit or a credit history becomes vitally important for every person who is trying to apply for an auto loan or a home loan, or even just applying to live in an apartment while they go to school or live closer to their job so they're not commuting computing so far. I mean, it's something that affects every slice of life, and access to it becomes a question of necessity and not so much like, well, I don't really need it right now. I can afford and live within my own means. And it becomes quite a debilitating situation to be in, especially for younger people. And of course, America's in a weird place because the younger and younger generations, under the consequences of both immigration and our policies of preferring diversity when it comes to, say, small business loans or home loans and things from the Clinton administration to things that have been brought on by Biden. I don't know what Trump has touched on these issues either, but it's like again, like I mentioned earlier, there's so many third rails that this like just intersects and cross cuts into that it becomes this Gordian knot. And I think that you have to start somewhere, which I think is what the Trump administration has announced on doing is that they're going to start laying the blade on one part of the knot and seeing what else comes frayed or comes open, and we can address and talk to those issues. And I'm all for that because it needs to be done. Yes, there should be more financial education, but also at the same time, we have a culture where we have instant gratification. We have the issue that no one reads the end user like license agreement when it comes to installing a new operating system or a new program or anything on their phone or applying for things. But also, it doesn't matter if you have good credit or bad credit. I mean, I check my mail every like couple of days, and all the time you see littered advertisements in my apartment by in the trash, where it's just like all these like credit card or loan applications and checks that are you're magically pre-approved for, that no one is really going to read all the fine print or what the interest rate is on there. And again, it's the same thing with like, well, America's the only country in the world where we allow pharmaceutical industries to like openly market their drugs on the TV airwaves, where other countries don't do that. And so a lot of this does boil down to what we had mentioned earlier. There's going to be a lot of special interests in mind that comes forward into this. There's going to be a lot of questions as to how do you even start to address the over-financialization of everything? There was a great take where it says, most of the economy is entirely vibes-based. It's not really what's on paper, what your output is. It's what you can convince investors and consumers that the product is actually good for you or good for your portfolio. So it has to come down to the fact that there needs to be, I think, in the same way, a Gerald Ford moment where the State of the Union financially is not good, whether it's the American government's, like our sovereign debt problem and our debt to GDP ratio, but also just that the average American is both those who are considered middle class and otherwise that have voted for Trump in the past on economic issues, whether it's the issue of trade or reindustrializing America. It's like, okay, these are good things. And of course, once we deport more people and the issues that we're talking about here, whether it's the credit issue or the housing issue alleviates, you still have the longstanding problems that institutionally there is so much rot that we have accepted as a feature that you have to start somewhere. And I think that this kind of conversation is very good because it's the kind of economic populism that Trump has championed on in the past, but it's the exact same kind of economic populism that his political rivals have been outflanking Republicans on for years, that so many lock, stock, and barrel traditional National Review style Republicans don't want to play because that's against their economic orthodoxies or their own first principles.
Well, and that's the real issue, right? Because I think you're right exactly that both these issues are home runs because the way, not only because they're good for people, which should be the first concern, but also politically they're winners because the narrative is just right there for you, right? Like, this is economic populism. We're going to undercut the Bernie Sanders, the AOC messages. We're going to come in. They might say these are insufficient or something, but they can't argue about the quality of either of these. They can't say, oh, well, this is hurting the little guy, that kind of thing, right? So I think that they are both, optically good, strategically good, and have the virtue of also being good for the people. The largest problem, I think, with the second one, with the credit card company, will be conservatives. I think that's going to be the hardest thing, not just because I'm sure the credit card companies own large amounts of politicians, but just genuinely, there seems to be among many, National Review, free trade, even, mainstream Christian conservatives seem to think that like just open-ended interest rates are that's what freedom is. That's what liberty means, is allowing a company to charge 40% on a credit card, to charge 2,000% on a payday loan. Like that's what economic liberty was talking about. That's Adam Smith right there. And so, I think the largest pushback he's going to get are from people inside his own constituency, or not his own constituency, but inside his own party. And that creates an interesting dynamic because we have watched this conservative civil war unfold. And it's largely been over Israel. Like, we'll just be honest. It's very clear that there's a neocon wing and they expect large amounts of loyalty to Israel, and they perceive the new right as personified with like JD Vance as the successor of Trump to be in somehow in opposition to this, despite, the very angry protestations of many America Firsters that that's not the case. And so you have the scenario where they have already been trying to push back against, they've been trying to play this game where they're like, well, we're on Trump's side, but we don't like Vance, or we don't like the new right. We don't like the people around him. So they're trying to like control MAGA, rebrand it, gain control of it. No, MAGA is actually about foreign adventurism and, infinite war and support for Israel. That's what MAGA was always out about, at the outset. But the problem is, like, if Trump comes in with something like this, they're gonna have to go hard in the paint against him, right? Like, I don't see a lot of the neocons. I don't see a Ben Shapiro celebrating the capping of credit cards at 10%. I don't think Max Abrams is going to be running around celebrating this as a pro-Trump guy. And so this is going to, I think in a way, this is kind of an interesting way to smoke out some of those guys, because they're going to have to go directly at Trump to counter this, right? Like, and that's going to, they've been trying to play this no man's land game where like, no, we're the real never Trumper, or we're the real Trumpers, even though we were all never Trumpers before. And like, you guys are the ones betraying Trump. But if they're going to be arguing and attacking Trump's principles when it comes to credit card companies, I think they're going to have a harder time holding themselves up as like the paragon of, economic populism or something.
Yeah, and I mean, we saw this as well during the COVID era. I mean, there is the question of spending. And like I had mentioned earlier, there's just so many issues about these proposals that are going to once again reiterate the same debates that we've had previously. And I mean, again, they're not bad debates to have. I mean, obviously the health of the American economy is like a very important one to like look into. And we shouldn't be taking that so lightly. We obviously really need to be heavily looking into and considering where are we going from here when it comes to the state of the United States economy, but also the average person's ability to afford a home and everything. And those debates, I think, are going to be had more on the right than they are on the left. The left is very straightforward about what they want to do, which is either to overregulate anything so their own special interests have regulatory capture, or to engage in economic redistribution policies. And as we've seen with, the people on Zoran Mamdani's team, that primarily affect white people. And of course, with it being New York, that's probably also going to affect a large portion of American Jews that live in the New York City area. I mean, like, that's just a very blunt thing that they're probably going to be doing about that when it comes to who is footing the bill for these things. And so I think that when you're looking at the debate, or even the claims of this being a canard about, bigotry or racism or whatever, the question is going to be like, the focus needs to be primarily above all things, the health of the American worker and the health of the American citizen. And that's really where our priority should be. The government's duty is to take care of and to be sovereign over its citizens and provide for its commonwealth. And if we're not doing that, then the question of legitimacy and sovereignty remains to be held. And we have to really remind the audience and remind the listener here that, and you and I have said this in other places, but again, like, this is the first relatively competent right-wing administration of our lifetimes. And it feels like a drop in the bucket about how bad things are. And addressing all issues at the same time is going to take years. It can't be done in one single presidential term. That's why there's been so much attention about the quote-unquote new right, JD Vance, and all these accusations about who he associates with or who he follows on Twitter and what he says, either to defend the administration and its actions or the rest. But when we look at the health of the country overall, there is so much work that needs to be done. And Trump is offering, I think, at least an economic platform, for good or for bad. It is going to be offering the Republicans, I think, a much needed CYA, because they haven't done anything in the 2 years that they've been in office. You've signed a few pieces of legislation, including the One Big Beautiful Bill, which is good for the Trump administration and especially good for the Department of Homeland Security. But overall, I mean, Congress has done very little, and it's pretty bad when former congressmen and former speakers of the House have said, Congress has really been riding on the president's coattails and hasn't really been doing much about their own agenda and putting forward a reason why they should be reelected. And so Congress has largely abdicated its responsibility. More things get done that are to the antithesis of the American interest and the American people than anything else. And while, God bless him in his final days, former Senator Ben Sass had said it best during the Brett Kavanaugh hearings in 2017. Congress has effectively abdicated its responsibility. It writes shell pieces of legislation, which directs the executive branch to do things. And when the executive branch does something that the American people don't like, the Supreme Court becomes the politics of last resort in the United States. And this is why we've seen SCOTUS be more active than ever, because it really does seem that the only way that the Trump administration can legally enshrine any of its actions or its interests is through the Supreme Court, because Congress doesn't want to do its job. And so if the president wants to establish an economic plan and focus on the domestic issues, especially on two big hot button ones like interest rates and affordability of a home, especially when he has been considered to be the affordability president and to be the guy that wants to make the economy work again, then he needs to do this. But he's also going to need a party that isn't going to try to impeach his secretaries and his cabinet positions every other day for the rest of his 2 years in office after the midterms.
Yeah, it's just obvious that Congress is over, right? Like technically, it'll still be there and have power and vote on things and obstruct the president or not at moments. But in general, the idea that we're like going to deliberate on stuff and, work it out and then pass meaningful legislation, I think that's just kind of done, right? Like we can't even pass budgets anymore. We're lucky if we can get continuing resolutions through Congress at this point. So, I mean, we were talking about the community relations services yesterday, and it just got photocopied into a new budget. It looks like that's kind of the level of bureaucracy we're at. Is it's so impossible to get anything done in Congress that you can't even just get like language in a budget or appropriations continuing resolution solved. Like that's how impotent Congress has become. And of course, we've talked, quite a bit about the amount of authority that's been transferred into the bureaucracy because Congress can't make decisions when it comes to things that are supposed to be expert, that kind of stuff. And I talk about that a good bit in the Total State if people want to read my book. So these are all issues that have faced Congress for years. And I think these are just what happens as you move towards an empire, as you move away. Like the republic's done. Democracy is kind of just a shibboleth at this point. It's really just the only thing that can really be done is, the momentum of the bureaucracy, the authority of the executive, and then the decisions of 9 people on the court. When it comes to actually having some large scale deliberative body trying to move legislation, draft it, I think that's more or less done. And so that creates this dynamic where, Trump is just trying to find avenues that he can, use his power to move anything and hope that the courts just kind of agree with him or don't block him. That is kind of just the game that is now being played. Congress is largely irrelevant. And I think that's going to be the case going forward. And I don't think Congress is going to be held accountable for this. I think people are just going to call for the president to do more. People are going to want to see the president take more authority, take more action, possibly defy courts, to get things done. I think you're going to see more and more call for that kind of stuff. And so the interesting dynamic is going to be, what happens there. But before we go, Matt, I'm gonna do something that I should never do, and I'm gonna do it twice. So sorry. First, I'm gonna ask you to make a prediction, and I'm gonna ask you to make a prediction about the future in the past, because we're doing this. We're pre-recording this, so we won't have all the information. So not only are you having to make a prediction, you're having to make it in the fog of war. However, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you this. With everything going on in Minnesota, obviously we don't need to rehash everything we've talked about on the show, the shooting and whatnot, but there are continued protests happening. There are people being arrested. There is violence still going on, not as severe. Obviously, no one is dead yet in Minnesota, again, from conflicts with ICE. But it's very clear that the left is continuing to try to build this George Floyd situation into a new, winter of love, I guess, is what we're looking for here, going into different elections and whatnot. Do you think that that's going to continue to escalate? Do you think that there just isn't the passion? It's too cold. We don't have the NGO mobilization, or do you think they will get this off the ground and we will see continued violence in Minnesota?
On Minnesota, I think that there will be, not just in the state of Minnesota, but in other places in which ICE is operating, the revolutionary mindset of a lot of protesters and paid activists, or those that have gone to be quote unquote legal observers, which has been with the National Lawyers Guild. And if you want to read Burroughs' book, Days of Rage, you'll understand that that has basically been a legal arm to be eyewitnesses on the ground for various left-wing terror and actions in the past. So I'm not really surprised to see that this has taken place. Furthermore, I know that we're talking about this in the past, but I think that it has been safe to say that a lot of revolutionary groups and a lot of people who want to put the law enforcement officials and the immigration and customs enforcement people up on the line, they want questionable optics and use of force because that mobilizes them, that galvanizes them, and that does it. But we also
train to actually produce it like that. Yes. It's not just that they want, like they specifically have
you're absolutely
manuals
right.
And guidelines and training classes.
Yeah, this is not a layman's organization. This is very much direct and in your face about this is planned. There's a lot of money involved, and that's something that the DOJ really does need to go after. I do foresee that there will be probably more violence in the future on these questions, and that there's also going to be a very ugly question in place about where the responses are going to be. Will there be more violence? I am afraid to make this prediction because obviously no one wants to be wrong, but I'm cynical because I think that they want it to escalate. They want it to escalate that way when things warm up after this winter passes. They have all these litanies of names that they can go off of and do it. However, the woman who had been shot by the ICE officer, it's not no one's gonna really riot in Minneapolis in the middle of January. It's too cold. And also it is a white lesbian, which again, if you're a white lesbian and you're on the left, you probably know somewhere in the back of your head that you are not valued because of your race and because of your identity than say a black person is. And so it's going to be like an Aaron Bushnell situation where you will be forgotten, or you will be a person who they will argue that you shouldn't say rest in power over, despite you dying for a supposed left-wing cause. You're not Captain Marvel, like this isn't a superhero movie where the 90-pound woman can somehow take on a bunch of, trained armored law enforcement agents and win. As we saw what happens, if you try to pull those things, there will be lethal consequences to them. And I think that the administration, above all things, in the wake of this violence and any more that follows, it really needs to tell its agents that we're on your side. Andy Ngo, who has almost been killed for his reporting on Antifa over the years, had done some research, and someone is threatening to hack or has a list of all those that have applied to be in ICE and with DHS since the Trump administration started. There is nothing stopping that list from coming out, and there's nothing stopping a new Democratic administration from leaking that list to friendly and Antifa-adjacent organizations to go after you and your families. So the administration needs to send a message right now. Not only are we supporting the officer who took these actions, but we will be supporting all of our agents against any threats to their home or their family or their person. Because if not, once they're out of office, the sword of Damocles is well over them, and it's probably going to fall on their necks. So my prediction is yes, there will probably be more violence. There will be more rioting potentially if it does escalate in the spring as things warm up. But I think that there should be body cameras on every DHS and every ICE agent in the country who goes out on these raids, because we saw that with police body cameras. This was a champion thing on the left, and it has more or less validated every single use of force by police officers almost every single time. So I think that the same should be done for those trying to kick out the people who should not be in this country to begin with. And if you want to die for the people who shouldn't be here, then I don't have a country to share with you. I'm sorry. You have chosen the side of the invader, and I don't have as much sympathy as I probably should for you.
Yeah, it's really important. If they hadn't had that cell phone camera footage from the officer who was struck in that attack, we might be facing a very different situation. So yeah, absolutely something that needs to be available, should be made public immediately so people can know what's going on and the deceptive practices that many of these people are engaging in to generate exactly the type of situation you're talking about. All right, guys, well, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Once again, this is pre-recorded, so sorry, but we cannot take your questions today. If it's your first time on this channel, please make sure you subscribe on YouTube. Make sure that you click the bell, notifications, all that stuff. If you want to get these broadcasts as podcasts, you need to subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. Matthew, if people want to follow your work, where should they be going?
Sure, you can find me on Twitter at Mr. Prudentialist. You can usually find the amphibious profile picture that I have on there. I'm also on Substack, theprudentialist.substack.com. There'll be a lot more essays in the works coming in for this year. I want to be really focusing on writing more. I want to keep that muscle as strengthened and as trained as possible. It says I'm on the air so often with people like you and your gracious invitation. Alongside that, I have a YouTube channel by the same name. I am often covering a variety of literature that is important to our political thought and today. So a week from now, when this comes out, I will have covered Georgia Sorrell's Reflections on Violence with my friend Dime as we host a show, Do You Even Read? And from there will just be more essays and things like that coming out, both for the channel, but as well as on Substack. So as always, I'm grateful to have you on. And oh yeah, last but not least, I'll be on the upcoming issue of Frontier Magazine with Blaze Media. So I'm looking forward to that being published.
Excellent, excellent. Of course, guys, if you want to read Matthew's articles along with all the other great Blaze content, of course, you need to not only be a Blaze subscriber, but you need to have access to that Blaze Unlimited. You need to have that VIP upgrade so you can get that nice, beautiful, luxurious magazine in your hand every quarter. So make sure that you check that out. Thank you once again, everybody, for watching. And as always, I will talk to you next time.